Timo Andres with the music of Philip Glass.
Hi, John.
Before we unpack, as you say, the four specific etudes you chose to play for us tonight, let's talk about the set as a whole, and specifically how you came to these pieces and what your relationship with the Philip Glass etudes has been.
I've been playing these pieces now for a decade, and it was kind of a funny story, actually. Thank you for asking.
It's kind of what I do.
I was going to travel to London for a completely unrelated concert in 2013, and got a somewhat panicked call from my friend Nico Muhly, composer some of you may be familiar with. He was supposed to play some etudes at the Barbican as part of this festival he was running, including number 13, which you didn't hear me play, but is a kind of a real up-tempo number, very it's a real party piece. Lots of scales and lots of contrary motion scales. It's one of the more etude-like of the etudes. And he was like, "It's too hard for me. Can you come play it? I don't have time to practice it." So I was like, "Sure, of course, I'll be in town anyway, you can buy me a nice dinner or something." And so I learned it, and then I guess about a week before the show, I got a somewhat more panicked call from the people at the Barbican saying that another of the pianists had fallen sick and would be unable to travel there. And could I possibly learn etudes, I think it was 15 through 20 as well. So I was like, "Oh, sure, I'll be there anyway, might as well." And that was how I got off the ground with the etudes. Was I played them. I played about 6 of them at the Barbican for an audience which included Philip Glass, which was sort of like, you only live once, right? So that's really how I got into them, and I just discovered that I loved playing this music. I hadn't actually played much of Philip's music before that. I was certainly familiar with a lot of it, but most of what I knew was early, Einstein on the Beach and Music in 12 Parts, and these sort of very pure, more purely minimal compositions that I was so enamored of. And so I didn't know quite what to make of the etudes, which are much more romantic almost, and much more through composed, even as they bring in elements from those early works.
Did it strike you at the time that there were at least 2 pianists engaged to play this single set of pieces? That it wasn't just... Because this has become a thing with the etudes, is having multiple pianists perform them.
I'm trying to remember who else was... It was Nico, and Philip himself, I think, played a handful of them, and me, and I'm trying to remember if there were any others there, but we've done them with as many as 10 pianists on one show, so each pianist plays 2, and that's always fun because you really get a nice a real diversity of viewpoints and interpretations, which is something that I know Philip himself really enjoys and looks for.
Well, I've put up the beginning of Etude number 6 for exactly that reason. That this etude actually is one that I commissioned. It was originally written for the 50th anniversary of our radio station, WNYC FM, which was in 1994. And cutting a long story short, I commissioned short pieces from 12 composers, all inspired by a poem that John Ashbery had given us for the occasion. And Philip's original title for this piece was no longer very clear was the name of the poem. Philip called this piece Now So Long After That Time, which was a line in the poem. And Christopher O'Reilly premiered the piece at Alice Tully Hall at Lincoln Center, and his version was very different from what you played for us tonight.
Yeah, John actually just played me his recording of the premiere, which of course you had on cue.
Of course.
Again,
no, I actually had to go digging for it, surprisingly.
And it is like maybe half the tempo that I play it, and very romantic, very almost like a moody kind of Rachmaninoff etude tableau type of feeling. And I have to say it was very convincing. Like there's something about this music that is wonderfully malleable. And, I've heard pianists play it all different ways over the years. And even my own interpretations, I find shifting every time I come back to it.
Well, and if you don't have to be, completely fluent in musical notation to see that we have notes on a staff and precious little else. There is a tempo marking at the very beginning, but after that, things like, dynamics and accelerandos and there's so much. It's almost like Baroque music, where there's a kind of openness to different possible interpretations.
Yeah, I think there are a number of things going on there. I think the development of music notation over the centuries has largely been one of moving toward greater and greater specificity and larger and larger quantities of information conveyed on the page, so that a lot, you see these contemporary scores, especially, and scores from the modernist period of the 20th century that are, the page is just, black with information. And I think, Phil, again, this sort of goes back to, excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold.
You and me both, I should say. This is not my normal...
I'm going to sneeze at some point this evening. It just hasn't happened yet. It really goes back to the early works of Philip. These pieces like music in fifths, music in similar motion, these pieces that were almost conceptual in their kind of structure and the way they played themselves out very procedurally, in which you had no dynamics, not even the instrumentation would be specified. It would be like, oh, you can play this with any band of players that you've got handy.
There it is.
Excuse me. As Philip's music got more kind of, I guess, traditional, for lack of a better word, there began to be more indication, phrase markings and slurs and dynamics and tempos and even the occasional expressive marking. I mean, very, very few and far between. But I do think it is almost, it's comparable to what one might find in, say, a Mozart sonata, which, was at a point in classical music where composers were beginning to, be very specific about dynamics, but they weren't yet getting very extreme about things. And, it marks some phrases and some articulations if they were really important, but generally left well enough alone and it was left up to the performer. And I think that is really what Philip had in mind in notating these scores, is he's specific about certain things, but he also wants to leave you room to make your own thing.
And I wonder where in the process that idea occurred to him, because he was very clear in an early interview in our studio back in 1995 when he came in to play what would become Etudes 2 and 3. He said, "This is music for me to play." He wanted something that he could go out, not have to bring the whole band and all the electronics and all that stuff. And at some point, so clearly at that point he knew what he wanted from these pieces, but at some point he had to kind of release control over these pieces in a sense as they went out into the world.
Right, and it's a bit of a hard process for any composer to do, I think. It is a little bit like watching your children go out into the world. I mean, I assume. I don't have any children. I have a lot of pieces. But for Philip specifically, it's a bit of a special case because he always made his living so much as a composer-performer.
Yes.
And the Philip Glass Ensemble was such a huge part of that, of touring these kind of evening-long works. And if you wanted to hear them, you had to hire the Philip Glass Ensemble. And for many of them, that's still the case to this day. And this was true of a number of conceptual artists from that kind of generation. I mean, certainly Steve Reich,
right.
With the sort of journey that pieces like Music for 18 Musicians and drumming took to, even from not even existing as notated scores to being kind of transcribed and now accessible to anyone, or Lucinda Child's dances, having companies other than her own put those on, or Meredith Monk and her vocal ensemble. I mean, a lot of these are still open questions, like how are these works going to kind of outlast their creators? And I think the Etudes is a kind of wonderful encapsulation of that. It's such a kind of it's a body of work that is at once kind of enormous, but relatively easy to parse. It's like, okay, you've got these 20 solo piano pieces, and they kind of, move through these different techniques. They explore these different techniques. And the journey from, being Phil exclusives to, maybe a few other pianists could get a hold of them if they knew Phil or knew someone who knew him, or, and over the years sort of getting them together. And we have, the wonderful production company Pomegranate Arts to thank for that a lot, of sort of like, first of all, getting Philip to complete the set, complete all 20, and then sort of putting together the initial run of complete performances, and those were kind of coincident with the publishing of the first edition of the scores. That was, I think, almost exactly 10 years ago now.
Right. But what are we looking at right now? Where is this from?
So this is yet another step on the journey, and it's kind of the reason that we're here tonight, is to celebrate yet another edition of the Etudes. This is kind of the most special of special editions that you could imagine, that encompasses both new scores, new engravings of the actual music, and a book of essays by various luminaries on Philip's music and on the Etudes specifically, all kind of wonderfully boxed up in this really beautiful package. And I should say that I worked on the engravings of this music in conjunction with Philip's publisher, and we were very geared toward playability, readability, ease of use. And rather than putting everything together in a big book, each etude, it's 20 separate folios that come in this box, so you can kind of take one out, put it on your piano. It lies nice and flat. It's big. It's easy to read. And Yeah, I think they're just kind of ideal documents. It's, as like Philip, I'm a self-published composer, and I am very kind of cognizant and very very picky about how my materials look and how they're produced. And I have observed firsthand the difference that it can make when it comes to actual performances. The better the materials, the better the performance. And the more the musicians will want to spend time with the music. I sincerely believe that. Well,
We've already discussed a little bit how, as an interpreter of the music, there are decisions you're going to make. Christopher O'Reilly in the world premiere, as you say, very kind of lush, romantic. I too was reminded of Rachmaninoff. I've heard very steely-fingered, motoric versions of this etude. You are somewhere in a middle ground between those two. So as an interpreter, you're making choices. When you're working on the engravings, and this is going to be the version of the piece that goes out to other potential pianists, you're still making choices, right? There are still decisions.
Very much so. I mean, the music notation is not an exact science, and given a musical idea, there are usually any number of different ways that you could notate it. This was complicated, of course, by the fact that multiple versions of these pieces tend to exist all in Philip's hand, with differences between them.
Right.
And so, you'd ask him one day, like, oh, what, is this note right in this edition or that edition? And one day he would say one edition, and one day he'd say the other edition. And you can go listen to recordings, and pianists do different things, and it's all kind of a crazy mess for the musicologists to figure out. But we've tried to encapsulate the most current of thinking on the various editions.
So, etude, the word etude literally means study. Mm-hmm. And if you talk about the Chopin etudes, or especially the Debussy etudes, where he's very specific about what technical challenge each study is for. Mm-hmm. What about these etudes? What do you sense a specific focus of study in each work?
Certainly in some of them. I wouldn't say in all of them. I'm not sure if Philip set out to with like a particular technical goal in mind for all of them. I mean, there are others. Certain of them, it's very obvious. I mean, the first one I play with the ostinato, the motor that runs through the entire piece. Exactly the same beginning to end. That one is really about kind of. It's about stamina and about kind of direction, velocity, and about sort of figuring out how to pass it between the hands at different points smoothly, which you have to do. The number 6, which we have up there. I think it's very much about repeated notes and about kind of shaping a melody through repeated notes, which, on the piano is kind of a trick that you need to learn how to do. I think number 5, the slow F minor one that I played, that one is very much about voicing. Mm-hmm. So it's almost written like organ music or something. You have these different parts, these kind of 4 different parts that you hear separately, and then in the end you hear them all together. And the challenge is kind of to shape each one separately and keep them distinct while allowing them to kind of mesh beautifully.
And as we look at number 5, more sparsely populated, perhaps note-wise, but clear, crescendos and decrescendos, lots of ties, there is a lot of kind of emotion kind of baked into the notation of this piece.
I think so, and the choices that he's made in What to Show expressively, I think, are, very indicative. But again, like if you only did those things, it wouldn't be enough. Mm-hmm. And, I remember very distinctly the first time I played for Philip, which was the morning of that day at the Barbican in London 10 years ago. And I was very, I had like, it was maybe 3 editions ago. It was like a very like pre-release, like Sibelius file that I was playing from. And I was only doing what was in the score because I didn't want to presume, I didn't know if he would not like if I was, making too many interpretive choices. And he kind of listened very politely to me playing for a little while. And he was like, you can be more free with it. You can play it more like Schubert. And since then, I've actually done a program a number of times where I intersperse these with Schubert impromptus, which I came to find works very well. And in fact, Schubert is one of Philip's favorite composers, and you can really hear the parallels between the music.
Fun fact, they share a birthday.
True.
January 31st, Schubert and Glass. Number 20 really brought Schubert to my mind.
Very much, yeah.
What do you think? Do you think he intended that as a final statement in this?
Definitely.
Because when I hear a set of etudes, I expect 24. One, one for each of the major and minor keys. But that's not how this set works.
That's true. There are keys. There are keys that one associates with Philip, and he definitely doesn't write music in every key. I mean, that's true of many, many composers. Actually, certain composers gravitate towards certain keys, and Philip loves F and F minor. There are a lot that are sort of around F, and a lot around C and A, which are actually one thinks of as simple keys because they have no accidentals, but they're actually very hard to play on the piano because your fingers are actually different lengths, right? So they kind of naturally want to go in there. So keeping them all actually on the outside of the keyboard is a little tricky. But no, number 20, he calls it kind of, I think he calls it like going out the door. He's like leaving the room. That's the gesture of number 20. And it's one that I particularly love to play, and especially when you hear it at the end of the whole set, after about 2.5 hours of music, it's really like it's so kind of deep and so surprising. You get kind of writing in that piece that doesn't really occur in any of the others in terms of the melodic shapes and in terms of the way that the counterpoint works and just sort of the periodicity of things occurring and recurring.
There's almost a kind of classical development of the material at that point, which again harkens back to the age of Schubert. The etudes were written in basically 2 blocks, is book 1, book 2.
Yeah.
Book 1 really does have lots of the kind of cycling, repeating phrases and patterns that we associate with classic Philip Glass. The second book, it seems, gets more into this almost traditionally classical world, it seems.
Yeah, for sure. There is definitely a dividing line between 10 and 11, and when we do the whole set, that's where we put an intermission.
Right.
And it's a very clear boundary. The music becomes much more rhapsodic, much more kind of, I'd say the rate of change is faster. In book 2, you don't have like pieces like number 10, the ostinato one, where you have like one thing going through the whole piece. Like, it's much more broken up into kind of chunks of music that are in conversation with each other. Though, Actually, as soon as I say that, I'm kind of backtracking. I feel like number 14 actually does have an ostinato that goes through the whole thing, and that one is the bluesy one, which you may know, the A flat major. But yeah, and then there are ones like 17 and 19 that are like kind of all over the map that feel like almost filmic, that feel cinematic, like really bringing in sort of the drama that we associate with like his operas and film scores.
And symphonies.
Yeah.
You've mentioned number 10 a couple of times, and if we look at that score, there is the kind of, again, the repetition is visible in the score, but there are also these kind of fanfare moments that jut out from that rhythm.
Yeah.
And if we were talking about an earlier composer, Mozart, or even, say, Mahler, you might say, oh, that's like a hunting horn. But what I get from it is a car horn.
Yeah, or a train. I think of a train.
Yeah, I mean, but it's about, this is a guy whose whole career has been in New York City. The energy, the rhythm, the drive of the city seems to be part and parcel of this piece.
Very much so. I think, it can be a hard thing to put your finger on, especially, so close, like this stuff is still contemporary. It's easy to look back on like, I don't know, Mussorgsky and say like, oh, that music is so Russian. It's so like Russian 19th century, because it has in common all these things with Russian literature and art and so on and so forth. And, Philip's music, like any great composer, is in conversation with the time and the place, and there is something that's incredibly New York-y about it. I think so too, and the energy and also I think the melancholy of it. Mm-hmm. You get a sense of like, and I think it's one of the qualities in Philip's music that really speaks to people, maybe more than any other, is this kind of sense of being an individual in a huge world,
And so it was very effective going from 10, which you started with, to 5, which has that kind of poignant sensibility.
Very much so. I mean, I just even practicing it these past couple of weeks, watching as the tree outside my window slowly loses all its leaves, like, it's process music.
Right.
It's like it was so resonant somehow.
It's in conversation, as you say, with everything that's been around Philip Glass as a New Yorker, as an American in the 20th and early 21st centuries, obviously very connected to the visual arts, dance, etc. It's also music that's in conversation with Philip Glass's existing body of work.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
So, for example, in number 6, we were listening to this earlier, and with the folks from Pomegranate Arts, and there's a little bit of little semi-quote from La Belle and La Bête,
Right, and even in one reason I wanted to play 5 and 20 is that at the end of 20 you get that same figuration from the left hand in number 5, that oscillating third.
Right.
It's the exact same thing. And there are a couple other instances in the Etudes where you hear something that is shared between pieces, which is, it's never heavy-handed. Like it goes by maybe without you even noticing, but it's just one of those little things that ties the set together. And yes, the fact that it does, often take themes or tropes from other pieces, I think is one of those things that makes it a nice kind of encapsulation of a life's work. It's hard to think of a more prolific composer than Philip Glass. Like one can't even begin to really like take it. It's like Bach or something. But
who also wrote very self-referential music, often
true.
Echoing.
Well, and I think it's kind of a different way of approaching the craft. I mean, there's so many ways to approach it, and one thing that has always inspired me about how Philip does is this very kind of workmanlike approach. He's just there to write music for anyone who needs it, and like if you ask him, he'll probably try to make it happen. You know, and the productivity is in a way part of the work, and it's part of the life. I think that was probably true for Bach as well. I mean, obviously he had several children to feed, but you know,
Quite a few, yes.
But I do that kind of aspect of not being too precious about it in a way, you know. There are other composers I hugely admire, like you know, George Benjamin comes to mind, the esteemed, you know, British
Right.
Composer who writes, you know, maybe one absolutely like polished to jewel-like perfection piece like every 5 years. And they're great. But like I could never be that, and certainly Philip would never be that. But it is like to me it's refreshingly humble in a way.
Well, and it also puts the lie to the idea that the composer or any artist has to sit around waiting for that moment of inspiration, for that thunderbolt to happen to do their job.
Absolutely. And I think you know, I don't think Philip has ever really experienced a creative block as far as I'm aware. I mean, the guy just keeps going, and he, you know, it's all kind of a continuum. There have been times in my life when I've begun to sense that kind of way of working, of like, I finished a piece yesterday, today I'm going to start on the next one, and it's going to lead right, one is going to lead right into the next, and you know, I may not have even finished working out the ideas that I was working on in the last piece, and so I'm going to work on them again in the next piece. And you know, not every piece has to be a total reinvention of your style. And I think you look at a composer like Philip, or you know, Stravinsky, or you know, any of these sort of major figures, and you can definitely put your finger on like, oh, okay, this was the piece where he figured out this, or where he tried this thing for the first time, and it is sort of a marker. And then there's sort of a body of work that follows.
Well, and you know, people who wanted to be in touch with Philip Glass learned early on, don't email him or call him in the morning, because that was it. I mean, it was as if he had a quote unquote job, you know, like he had an office in the house, 9 a.m. he'd be there, and he had time where that was what he did.
That's the way to do it, I think. I mean, the work ethic is really inspiring, and you know, I think certainly for me, and I know a number of other composers who kind of use this method of like, okay, I've got 3 months to work on this piece. I'm going to do a little bit each day, 9 to 5, or you know, maybe work a little after dinner, and it gets done. You know, you learn your own pace of working, and it is far preferable to leaving it all until the last minute.
Or just hoping and praying for that bolt of inspiration to come.
You can't, I mean, maybe one of those comes along every so often, and you kind of, it might not even be the right time. You kind of note it down for later. But the day-to-day work of any artist, painting or playwriting or, you know, filmmaking, it's like, it's work. You know, it's like solving the day's problems. It really is.
Well, John Cage once said, begin anywhere. And as with so many things that John Cage said during his life, it's 2 words that just kind of like lay there on the page, and it takes a moment to realize the wisdom, the kind of Zen-like wisdom behind it. You don't have to have a beginning and a middle and an end plotted out. Just start, just do it.
Mm-hmm. And it's also such a proof of concept of like the materials themselves almost don't even matter. I mean, the materials that Cage often worked with, or certainly that Philip often works with, are so simple a lot of the time. You know, a couple of chords, a very simple arpeggio, you know, very simple harmony. And being a composer is kind of learning to see the potential in those simple ideas. See where you can sort of get your hooks into them and draw them out into a work, you know, because that's sort of the sense when you hear one of the etudes, that's the sense you get of like this very simple thing kind of spinning itself out into a kind of abstract narrative. I mean, that is composition.
Are you familiar with Philip's Modern Love Waltz?
A bit, yeah.
Yeah. In the mid-'80s, his friend Robert Moran, a composer with whom he wrote an opera, a very fine opera called The Juniper Tree, decided that he was going to create an album of works by all the contemporary big stars of American classical music, the modernists and the minimalists, and they could all interpret the waltz however they saw fit. So Milton Babbitt, of course, wrote a waltz in 5/8 plus 7/8 time instead of 3/4. And Philip wrote this piece called Modern Love Waltz, and it's exactly what you were just describing. It's a very simple piece, a repeating set of chords and a repeating, very typically Philip Glassian riff, for lack of a better word. And it's 2 minutes, and it's done, and, you know, basta. Dayenu, enough.
Right. Well, and certainly, you know, it's similar to what we might find in like, you look through Schubert's songs. It's like a lot of those share very similar kinds of accompaniments and very similar types of melodic lines, and you know, it's a lingua franca. It's not like I'm going to be so precious about, you know, every, you know. You can't be that precious and write hundreds and hundreds of songs.
Right. So here's the thing about Modern Love Waltz. So Philip wrote it for this occasion. It was literally an occasional piece. He wrote it for this album called The Waltz Project, which None Such put out.
Oh, I'm going to have to look that up.
Yeah. And then it kind of became this thing that other pianists started playing. And
who recorded the original disc?
I think it was either Robert Moran or Philip. I don't remember.
Oh, okay.
It was a long time ago, and it was just your description of, you know, the elements that Glass uses. That oh yeah, there was this kind of precursor to the Etudes, this Modern Love Waltz, which again went out there because it was accessible, it was playable. It was a solo piano piece, and there were solo pianists who wanted to be able to play some of Philip Glass's music, and there wasn't a whole lot out there.
That's true. That was pretty early on.
So now with the Etudes, and perhaps in asking the question, I'm also answering it, what do you think it is about these Etudes that can attract so many different pianists to come to it, to the point where you can put together a program with 10 different pianists, each doing 2?
Right. I mean, I think there is, you know, this word accessibility is, you know, kind of a loaded term in contemporary music often.
Yes,
but you know, I use the word accessible in a slightly different way here, which is to say there are a lot of different on-ramps for pianists in this body of work. Pianists of all different backgrounds and all different skill levels, actually. You know, some of them are quite difficult. Others are very manageable. And you can, it is, you know, in the tradition of composers writing etudes, yes, it's music that helps you get better at playing the piano, but it's also just music that's interesting to play and that's so engaging and so kind of emotional and narrative. But within the language of a composer, it's so rare to find kind of one work, or I guess body of work in this case, where you can kind of say like, yeah, that kind of sums it up. Like it's not just a great way to like get better at playing Philip Glass. It's a way to come to know his whole output in a way. Like it touches on every corner of it.
Like the string quartets of Beethoven. I mean, which...
Yeah, or the piano sonatas. I mean,
Yeah.
it's...
where you can follow the progression of his thinking as it goes through
and the
his
fact
career.
that they span, 30 years or so
Right.
in composition. I think that's important to it too, is that you kind of see this progression just as you would in the Beethoven sonatas or something. And, this idea of a form that a composer keeps coming back to, again, not so much these days.
Yeah.
You'll have a composer write like one of each thing, and like it's almost like, oh, I have to move on. There's so many different combinations. There's so many instruments. There's so many different things to write for. You've got to move on to the next thing. I kind of like this. There's this idea that is attractive to me, clearly attractive to Philip as well. I mean, how many symphonies does he have at this point? Over 10?
13?
Yeah. Yeah, and he keeps coming back.
He was in the middle of writing his 9th symphony, and he came to visit us in the studio, and I said, how do you get around the curse of the 9th? And he said, I'm writing the 10th at the same time.
There you go. Classic Phil.
So again, to come back to this idea of accessibility, that there are etudes that the price of admission is affordable for pianists who are not you or Christopher O'Reilly,
No, I mean, I think, right off the bat, I can recommend like number 1 and 2, number 5, number 16. Those would be great places for anyone to start, really.
So what is your hope with this new edition, that you've worked so hard on, the beautifully engraved edition of the piece? What is your hope in sending that out?
Well, I would say, having had one in my house for about 2 weeks now, it's a great thing to have in your house, especially if you happen to own a piano, which I do. But, even if you don't, it's a lovely thing to look at. And the essays themselves, this lovely little book of essays are quite fun to read and quite illuminating. And again, quite diverse in their interpretations and viewpoints. But yeah, no, I think it is somewhat rare these days for a living composer to kind of focus on this audience of kind of general interest in a way, not just not just professional musicians specializing in contemporary music, but amateur musicians of all kinds. I think the work, as we've said, is engaging for amateurs and professionals alike. I just love the idea of taking out a folio and reading through it, maybe working it up over a few weeks. I think that experience can be so rewarding and so kind of so grounding. I mean, it really is like, it's the satisfaction of making something, because Philip leaves you room to make your own thing, to make it your own. I mean, I think that's really why this particular format works for this music, because it is so portable. I mean, you don't even need a piano. Let's be honest. You can use a keyboard. You can probably use an iPad to play some of these.
I actually took out folio. I've had the set for a few weeks as well. I actually took out number 1 and thought, I wonder if I could do this on guitar. But then I realized
People do.
that would mean marking the score with a pencil is just too beautiful. I don't want to.
I'll send you the PDFs.
A final question. Being immersed in this set of pieces by Philip Glass, what has this done to or for you as a composer yourself?
Great question. You know, as a composer, I think, well, maybe more than most composers. I would say I think about form a huge amount, like form being sort of the way the music sits in time, the way that it occupies a certain amount of time. I think that's something that, you know, Philip particularly is kind of a master of, is like how to play with time via music. And I think, you know, you can hear a piece like number 20, especially, I think, and it just kind of feels timeless in a way. You kind of forget, time slows down. I mean, it's cliche to say,
Yeah.
but it really does. And the piece itself is only, I think, 8 or 9 minutes. Like, it's not very much time in the scheme of things, and yet it has this kind of wonderfully generous and kind of I'll say epic sweep to it. And then there are others that kind of make time go quickly. I mean, that are so exciting, and you know, this kind of way in which time is divided up. I think I have learned a huge amount from Philip, not just these works, but particularly these works. And you know, he has famously in his career taken on very long stretches of time. Sometimes, you know, Einstein on the Beach, you know, a 4.5-hour opera, music in 12 parts. I think performances of that last about 4 hours. I actually got to play that once, which was, you know, exhausting and incredible, and taught me so much, you know. So yeah, I mean, that's a pretty abstract answer, but you know, I'd say it's between that and actually just kind of the approach, the work ethic, the sort of humble approach of being sometimes you're more of an artisan than an artist.
So the difference between an art and a craft, I mean, there is
the craft is so serious in these pieces. I mean,
right,
yeah.
but there's almost no craft that cannot be elevated to an art form. I mean, even if you're a bricklayer, there are bricklayers who become sculptors because their works are just...
I visited the Roby house up the street this morning, and you know, the way they did the mortar on those bricks, I mean, it's a work of art.
Yeah. Timo Andres, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, John.